You're listening to the smooth sounds of the world according to Jen and Carolyn. Hey, everybody.
Hey, Jen.
So, what exciting shit are we going to be discussing this evening?
Dun, 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 psychopath.
Kinda. We're going to be talking about the stuff of serial killers. Like, you know, me and Carolyn, as I'm sure most of you, can name maybe 10 serial killers in under 30 seconds. But how much do we really know about traits and characteristics that are supposedly shared by a lot of serial killers? If you watched Mindhunter, which we love, you know that there's a lot of science that goes into profiling and catching and studying these motherfuckers. So we're going to break down a lot of stuff tonight. We're going to talk about something called the Macdonald triad, discuss the various types of serial killers, and ultimately we're going to try to answer the question, are there really personality traits that are universally shared by most serial killers, as some experts purport, or is it maybe a little more nuanced than that? Oh, no. I don't know.
Good questions.
Good questions.
Also, Macdonald triad makes me hungry.
You know what? To me, the Macdonald triad is like a quarter pounder, a 20-piece.
Oh, see, I go fries.
And then some fries, some big-ass fries.
I can't do nuggets and a burger. That's like one or the other.
Yeah. I mean, it depends how much weed I've smoked.
I was going to say, it depends how late the night is.
Yeah. If it's 3 a.m, I'm eating it. So, all right. We know there are a lot of movies and TV shows and podcasts about serial killers, but most of them are focused on the individual serial killers, rather than taking what we think is a more robust and scientific look at whether or not there really is kind of a universal pathology that a lot of these folks share. I think Mindhunter was a really good exception to
Love that
this.
show.
I know, but the motherfuckers canceled my show.
I know.
Somebody's got to pick it up.
I don't know why.
I know.
What's wrong with TV?
It was popular. People liked it.
Well, and again, this all came out of this, again, in psychology is such a new field.
Fucking
and it's only within the 50s that people really went, well, what's the purpose of this anyway?
Yeah.
And I always picture what happens again on Law and Order as a devotee of that show. Olivia and Elliot for life.
I never watched Law and Order.
You wouldn't. I don't think you could handle it.
Really,
it's really intense.
There's a lot of child.
There's a lot
crimes
of.
against
you can't
children.
watch SVU.
Okay,
like
no
I don't
special
want to watch
victims,
that, but
there's a lot of rape. I'm sure.
There are some allusions to that. Yeah. But it's interesting because why do we need to know this? From a detective standpoint, from a police standpoint, it really does help find them. But what bothers me, and this always happens on Law and Order, I know it bothered Briscoe and Chris Noth. These detectives would use all these skills and all this profile, and then it would go to judicial, and nothing would happen, or they'd get off.
Yep. Well, that does happen in real life. But I'm glad you talked about Law and Order so extensively, because according to the FBI, much of the general public's knowledge concerning serial murder is a product of Hollywood productions. So storylines are created to heighten the interest of audience rather than accurately portray serial murder. So by focusing on the atrocities inflicted on victims by deranged offenders, the public is captivated by the criminals and their crimes. And this only lends to more confusion to the true dynamics of serial murder. So we know Hollywood kind of fucks everything up, right?
So don't you think a lot of these murders are pretty sensational?
For sure. And I think the media definitely contributes to that.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating. And I think that we as human beings are amused, I don't know, call it whatever you will, with the grotesque and the macabre and things that are really disturbing. That's why people would show up in droves to public executions. Yeah. Like nothing would compel me to go to a public execution.
No.
I am nowhere near, even if God forbid somebody did something to my husband or my child, I don't necessarily know if I'd want to be present for that person being put to death.
I guess it was that entertainment back then.
It was.
This is pre-HBO.
We're not going to get into this. In fact, you know what? We should do an episode on... There's like a sexual component to it.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, God. Fucking weird. We're going to save that for another episode because tonight we're talking about serial killers. Yeah. So,
one deranged thing at a time, Jen.
Right, exactly. Put one foot in front of the baby steps. Deranged baby steps. So, okay, listen to this. This is insane. So, the definition of a serial killer, according to the U.S. Department of Justice, is a serial murderer has committed 2 or more murders separated in time and often in widely different geographic areas and involving victims who are usually strangers. The murders are usually compulsive acts for gratification based on fantasies. Now listen to the FBI's definition. The term serial killings mean a series of 3 or more killings, not less than one of which was committed within the United States, having common characteristics such as to suggest the reasonable possibility that the crimes were committed by the same actor or actors. So
That's weird.
Right. There's difference even between these 2 major U.S. departments dedicated to solving crimes.
Are they even communicating?
Well, I don't know. Some say that's how 9/11 happened. But I think there's more to it.
And also, I totally disagree about geographic areas.
Yeah, I know. I do as well. Where
did this come from?
Well, that's the thing. And I don't necessarily know, truth be told, how old these definitions are, but at least at one point in history, there was a conflict between these 2 definitions, between these departments that theoretically should be working together and should maybe, I don't know, have a universal definition of what a serial killer is.
Yeah.
So slightly conflicting. More on this later. So, Carolyn, do you know who the first recorded serial killer was?
No.
Yeah, I didn't either, actually. So apparently it's this guy named Gilles de Rais. Giles de Rais. Once you hear what he did, we will not care about us pronouncing his name right because he's a piece of shit. So some dude during the 100-Year War, he kicked some ass then and was a comrade of Joan of Arc, who is awesome.
Yeah.
That's cool, right? Well, not so fast. This motherfucker was the perpetrator of more than 100 gruesome child murders.
Oh, no.
Yep, a rampage which made him arguably the first serial killer in recorded histories and in history. And most historians concur that this shit is actually true. So fuck this guy. And so for this episode, rather than rattle off the names of the serial killers that I think are most familiar to all of us, we're going to jump right into the psychology components here and ask a couple of questions. So 1, is there a scientific way to predict whether someone is going to become a serial killer? 2, are there universal traits and characteristics that these sickos share? Okay, so we're going to dive into this. So let's talk a little bit about Mindhunter, which is a favorite of both mine and Carolyn. So the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit was formed in 1971 to apply the behavioral sciences to crime. We owe a lot to the real people who inspired Mindhunter. Their names were John Douglas, Robert Ressler, and Dr. Ann Burgess, who were like the pioneers of behavioral science and application to violent offenders. We love them.
Yes.
Douglas and Ressler's study of what they first called sexual killers, eventually released as sexual homicide. Their first study, which became the basis of the FBI criminal profiling, was based on interviews with 36 convicted sexual murderers, combined with information about 118 of their victims, primarily women. We know the famous ones they interviewed: Ed Kemper, Donald Harvey, Joseph Paul Franklin, Ted Bundy, David Berkowitz, John Wayne Gacy, Jerry Brudos. The list goes on. And some of them were actually featured in the first series or the first segment of Mindhunter. So, but let's not forget about Dr. Ann Burgess. She was already, at the point that this unit was formed, an expert in the treatment of trauma victims and the co-founder of the crisis counseling program at Boston City Hospital when she began consulting with the FBI.
This is in the 70s.
I know.
In the fucking FBI. How many women were probably there? Again, she's not a woman of color, but she's a fucking woman. Like, broke the boundaries there.
Trendsetter, right? Yeah. And so she actually started consulting with the FBI, and she was the one that was able to make the links between childhood trauma, particularly parental abuse, that has remained central to understanding how serial killers are formed. And that actually is true.
Yes.
The majority of serial killers had incredibly abusive, tumultuous childhoods, especially the ones who ended up hating women.
And it's a joke even when I say to my clients, like, sorry to get all Freudian here, but tell me about your mom and dad. Mm-hmm. Like, there is no therapy without talking about your developmental history.
Absolutely.
And whenever someone walks in, they're like, well, I had a really great family. I'm like, uh-huh.
We're going to break this down.
Yeah.
Tell me more lies. Okay. So, Carolyn, I'm going to defer to you here. Yeah. So, before the behavioral science unit, there were some folks who tried to predict if someone would become a serial killer based on certain behaviors, primarily childhood behaviors. Mm-hmm. So, why don't you tell us a little bit more about something called the Macdonald triad?
Yeah.
Try not to get hungry.
I'll try. All right. So, researcher and psychiatrist J.M. Macdonald published a controversial review in the early 60s. And there's been other studies that suggest a link between childhood behavior and tendencies toward violence in adults. So again, spoiler alert, there are plenty of people who might do some of these things, like regular bedwetting. I was a bedwetter.
Yeah.
Yep. There were many times. I don't kill people. So again, please don't think anything I'm saying is fact. These are theories.
Yeah.
Anyway, so regular bedwetting is one of them. Mm-hmm. Setting fire to objects or otherwise committing minor acts of arson, and being cruel or abusive to animals. Now, I would say if you're doing all three of those things,
there's some concern. Yeah.
There's concern. And I'll go into it a little bit. But the thing with animal cruelty, and something's got to be kind of off if you're doing that to animals again. But you could also argue that children who grew up hunting and things like that. But I'm not talking about that.
Yeah.
I'm talking about being cruel for an extended period of time to an animal. And this is common with children where the pathology is that they have been humiliated by adults.
Okay.
Which in and of that self is awful.
Yeah.
And so, again, children might act out their frustrations on animals or something they perceive as vulnerable. So you might see that even with siblings. Like it's actually a normative thing for older siblings when the baby comes to kind of be mean to baby at some point. It's competition. But again, this is someone who's really enjoying the control that they're having and taking into violent action. And again, it could be projection of something's happening to me, so now I'm reenacting that, and it gives me a sense of control. Fire setting's really interesting. Again, the fire setting to me also can be part of antisocial personality.
Sure.
I want to fuck shit up, and I don't care about authority, and again, I like fire, but I don't set fires. Like, I'm fascinated by fire.
Yeah. So, all humans are.
Yeah. And so Macdonald suggests that setting fires might also be used as a way for children to vent feelings of aggression and helplessness brought on by humiliation from adults. And it also indicates early signs of violent behavior. And although it might not, this is where it really gets gross if you're doing that with a living creature. That's
God,
cherry on top of that one. But there's this feeling of there being kind of a visible consequence that satisfies unresolved feelings of aggression.
Yeah.
I would say the same thing happens with like cutting or self-harm, things like that. There's some sort of cathartic feeling of I did that. Bedwetting or something called enuresis. Again, that is a normative developmental thing that happens. Please don't freak out if your child's doing that.
I'm freaked out.
Oh, Jen, your little white boy will not become a serial killer. We're working very hard on
I think he's too lazy to get up, and he's like, fuck it, I'm gonna lay here. I don't care. You take after dad.
But and again, it's also sometimes when you have traumas that happen or things like that, you can see regression in children with things like eating or bedwetting or things like that, or learned helplessness, things like that. But again, this feeling of everything goes back to exacerbating feelings of humiliation. And the child may feel more anxious and helpless as they continue this behavior. And, we do look at that as linked to stress and anxiety.
Okay.
When a kid is exhibiting that, and there are tons of other studies, a 1966 study, a 2003 study, a 2004 study, they all found different, again, the sample sizes weren't great, and, but they found that there was a correlation between that triad that would suggest that abuse, rejection, neglect by parents also does play a role.
Sure.
That often was found. But there is that idea that behaviors and, again, violent perpetration on animals and these behaviors, they can correlate. In 2018, there was an extensive study that actually looked at this lit review, and it really does say it's a reliable tool, but it has more to do with the dysfunctional home environment.
That makes sense.
Because a lot of those things can happen because you're not going to just wake up and do those things. You might.
Yeah.
But it's usually something has to happen prior to that would indicate that behavior.
Yeah. And I think that children who experience abuse and may exhibit this kind of behavior, which is brought on by that abuse, don't necessarily become serial killers. No. And at the same time, a lot of people who experience this sort of abuse and exhibit these behaviors and do become serial killers, there's a correlation.
That's what most of the studies found.
Yes, that makes sense. That makes total sense. Not to say like, oh, your child still wets the bed, they're going to murder people. That's not what we're here to say. And I don't think that's what this is necessarily trying to say. But yeah, interesting stuff. So back to this FBI profiling thing. So this is from a Newsweek article. The FBI continues to profile criminals based on criteria built by Douglas and Ressler. It begins with the assimilation of all available information, which includes, the crime scene, victim autopsies, witness testimony. The first classification is made based on this data between organized and disorganized murderers. Okay, here's where we break it down a little bit. So Douglas and Ressler, they split these serial killers into two broad categories. Generally, an organized murderer is one who appears to plan his murders or her murders in a conscious manner. We don't want to leave the women out, though it's mostly you men. Plans his or her murders in a conscious manner and who displays control of the victim at the crime scene. This was from the book they wrote, Sexual Homicide. The disorganized murderer is less consciously aware of his plan, and his crime scenes display haphazard behavior. Sometimes an offender has elements from both categories, and it can be called mixed. And sometimes, often, from what I understand, what happens is they learn as they go. And what might start out as disorganized becomes more organized because they're learning and they're getting, quote unquote, better. Yeah. So following classification, a criminal profiler will attempt to reconstruct the causality of the criminal's behavior throughout the timeline of the crime. And this is in order to establish a modus operandi that can be applied to subsequent murders or sexual assault. So commonalities between the behaviors of interviewed serial killers provide a database or pool of possible motives and methods. And that's what we see in Mindhunter, right? So
what's a modus operandi?
It's your MO. It's why you do the way you do something. Why you do something.
MO.
Yeah, your MO. Okay, we learned something.
You're smart.
I try. The next step is similar, but a little more specific to the idiosyncrasy. See, I'm not that smart. Of serial murderers, which don't often stem from more material motives like money or revenge. I listen to plenty of money and revenge.
Oh, yeah.
Motive murders on Dateline. We're talking about something different here. So, after establishing a working theory of the crime and how the killer operates, the FBI profiler look for the killer's signature, which is the way in which a serial offender gratifies himself psychologically during the crime. BTK, for instance. Bind, torture, kill. It's in the title. That's what he did.
Yeah.
That was his signature.
Yeah.
He got, and also drinking a glass of water at the scene was his thing. That was before DNA. I don't fucking know.
Yeah.
Weird shit. Okay. So the three most common motives of serial rapists and murderers turn out to be, according to at least Ressler and Douglas, domination, manipulation, and control. And when you consider that most of these guys are angry, ineffectual losers who feel they've been given the shaft by life, and that most of them have experienced some sort of physical or emotional abuse, as Ed Kemper had, really abused by his mother, like beaten down.
Really bad.
Yeah, terribly. It isn't surprising that one of their main fantasy occupations is police officer. And Ed Kemper, in fact, wanted to be a police officer. And the only reason why he didn't become a cop, you know why?
No.
He was too tall.
Jesus Christ.
They're like, you're too tall to be a cop.
Well, and then he was giving behavioral assessments.
Yep.
For the psychiatrist.
Oh, when he was
in prison.
Well, he was in...
What a manipulator.
He was in a psychiatric facility, not prison. When he was a teenager, he murdered his grandparents with a shotgun.
Yeah.
And he was put in Tascadero, I think it is, in the Santa Cruz area, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
And he is so intelligent that he was able to not only manipulate the people who are in charge of his care, but he was able to get them to allow him to administer psych evals to other patients.
That's how busy mental health professionals are. We'll even let the patients help.
Seriously.
No.
You're like, I can't keep up with my workload. Hey, Ed Kemper, murderer of your grandparents. You want to help me out? Cool.
That's pretty bad.
Okay, I know way too much about Ed Kemper, and we said this wasn't going to be about these individual fuckheads. So, a lot has changed since the inception of the behavioral science unit. So it makes sense that if you hear info that conflicts with original assessments made by Douglas and his crew, that's going to happen.
Yeah.
Right? We've come a long way. So, Carolyn, can you talk to us about some of the myths that the FBI is trying to dispel around serial killers' pathology?
Yeah. Serial killers, myth number 1, are not dysfunctional loners.
No.
The majority of serial killers often are not reclusive social misfits who live alone.
Mm-hmm.
They're not always, they are monsters, but they fit in.
Yeah.
That's actually part of how they go undetected.
Look at BTK again.
But most of them are what's often what people say. He was a great guy.
Yeah.
I had no idea.
Yeah, except Jeffrey Dahmer. He was a reclusive weirdo.
Yeah. Well, and again, that's the thing that I think you see both sides of the coin.
Yeah.
Just like with any human behavior, right?
Yeah.
And many serial killers, yes, do hide in plain sight with their communities. Serial murderers often have families and homes and are gainfully employed and appear to be normal members of a community.
Yeah.
In fact, the more normal you look, the more suspicious that would be.
Right? Look at Ted Bundy.
Yes.
You ain't normal, bitch.
Yeah. And again, being part of that blending is part of what's a survival skill.
Sure.
So it's oftentimes overlooked by law enforcement and the public.
Yeah.
This also made me think of Dexter.
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, talk about it. Although he's a good serial killer though, right?
Well, yeah, for the most part, yeah. I mean, he had to do some shitty stuff to like cover his tracks, but yeah.
So, again, myth number 2, serial killers are all white males. So again, contrary to popular belief, serial killers range all racial groups.
Yep.
There are white, African American, Hispanic, and Asian serial killers. The racial diversification of serial killers generally mirrors that of the overall U.S. population.
Yep.
So it's mostly, that's what you're going to see. In fact, Samuel Little, a black man, was the most prolific serial killer in U.S. history, confessing to the murders of 93 women.
He is insane.
And
have you seen the interview with him?
Oh, he freaks me out. His storyline in Mindhunter was really weird.
No, he wasn't. He wasn't in Mindhunter.
Wait, who was that guy then? That was the Atlanta. Oh, sorry, that was
the Atlanta child murderer, which they never found. I think they may have convicted somebody, but it wasn't for sure as to whether or not he actually did it. Samuel Little was incredibly intelligent and had a photographic memory and was an incredibly skilled artist. So when he was captured and imprisoned, he would draw pictures of the women that he killed because he remembered their faces. And in fact, a lot of the murders were solved. Family members were able to identify their family members because of the paintings, the pictures he drew.
Can you imagine, that's the last picture you have and
oof.
Giving me chills.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and I think we've talked about this before, kind of why that gets downplayed too from a racial perspective.
Sure.
Listen to our old podcast.
Yeah.
Another myth. Serial killers are only motivated by sex. All serial murders are not sexually based. In fact, it's you're more likely to be a rapist. And again, it's still not about sexual gratification. It's about control.
Yes.
Their motivations for serial murder are about the anger, the thrill, financial gain, attention seeking. And usually with serial killers, there's some type of, transmorphing of your parent figure onto the victim. And that's who you're actually taking over. The victim actually with serial killers has no value.
Okay.
Like as if you can't make it worse. Like
that makes sense.
they are prey. The person does not consider anything about them. So I'd actually be really surprised if any of these are sexually motivated. Another myth. All serial murderers travel and operate interstate. Most serial killers have a pretty defined geographic area of operation. And I think I'm curious how that pans out now with how easy it is to get around places. I mean, I think even just the art of serial killers is different now than it probably would have been 50 years ago, just because of how things are. But again, that's what made me feel weird about those two definitions that you started with. Was, all over the place. So anyway, you're going to stay within your comfort zone. You're going to be anchored to a certain point, a place of residence, employment, or a relative. Serial murderers will at times spiral their activities outside their comfort zone. But again, you're only going to see that when their confidence and, their hubris or their grandiosity, they do tend to be narcissists, grow to experience and they avoid detection. So very few travel interstate to kill. Again, I'm curious how that's shifting.
Occasionally they do. There's like Israel Keys, for instance. He would go interstate. He was a really interesting one. I don't know too much about him, but he had a rule. He didn't kill mothers or like mothers of young children.
Oh, God.
But he would travel.
An ethical serial killer.
Somewhat. Yeah, right. He had his own code. But he would travel to different states and for years, he would meticulously plan and stalk victims.
Jeez, who has the time?
But for the most part, it's like you look at the Green River Killer, for instance, whom I believe was a truck driver.
Yes.
And it was just convenient.
Yes. Part of his modus operandi.
Right. Yeah.
Using words.
Learning shit.
Another myth, Jen, is serial killers can't stop killing.
Right.
It's been widely believed that once a serial killer starts killing, they can't stop.
Yeah.
And again, they go up and down all over the place. Some serial killers stop murdering altogether before being caught. And in those instances, there are events or circumstances in offenders' lives that inhibit them from pursuing more victims. Wasn't that a Ted Bundy thing where that's how they knew when he left? Because the murder stopped in certain areas. And then when isn't that often a common thing too that
I can't remember, but I'm thinking of BTK specifically where he stopped for a really, really long time and then, went back to it. I think he had a kid or something.
Or Golden State Killer, maybe.
Golden State possibly as well.
Yeah.
These
serial killers age too.
Yeah, it's true.
They don't get caught.
Even Dahmer stopped for a short period. There's a cooling off period and then they pick back
up. Yeah.
And sometimes they don't.
Yeah. Here's another myth. Serial killers are insane or evil geniuses. So another myth that exists is that they're have this debilitating mental condition or that they're extremely clever and intelligent. Well, I do think that can be true for sure. But again, as a group, they often suffer from a variety of personality disorders, psychopathy, antisocial personality, and others. And most are not adjusted and insane but most don't get adjudicated as insane under the law. It's very difficult. I think that's the legislative or the judicial part that we don't quite have figured out.
Well, listen to our episode on mentally ill versus criminally insane, and we really break it down in that one, folks. If you've got any interest in that, check it out.
and again, serial killers want to get caught. No, they don't.
No, a lot of them want recognition. They don't necessarily want to get caught because that means they have to stop doing what they enjoy or feel they need to do.
It is a compulsion.
Yes.
That's what makes it a personality disorder. They're compelled to do this. Yep. And, again, they're, like you said before, the first time they're inexperienced, but again, as the personality disorder defines them, the grandiosity and the narcissism, you're going to see that happen too. So they're, again, for every blanket statement, I can probably think of 3 or 4 people who don't fit that profile. Yeah. And so therefore you can't make an overarching generalization there. And that's what makes it really hard in profiling.
Sure. That makes absolute and total sense based on what I understand as well. So in regards to narrowing down serial killer characteristics, we found a fascinating article featuring the famous Catherine Ramsland. She's a PhD, professor of forensic psychology at DeSalle. Is that how you say it? DeSalle University. From an organization called Hogan Assessments. I love Catherine Ramsland because I listen to
Which one is she?
She has written a number of books. I don't think she has a podcast necessarily, but she's mentioned in a number of podcasts. Okay. Anybody who's quoting an expert in, forensic psychology as it relates to serial killers will mention Catherine Ramsland. You can't, if you're into true crime, this name. So, this is what is said in this article featuring Ramsland. There's no personality type for serial killers, no matter what crime dramas want us to believe. Simplifying serial killers with false assumptions can be dangerous. One such assumption is that serial killers have a concrete set of identifiable personality characteristics. They don't. What they do have in common is meeting the FBI's definition of a serial killer. You've murdered at least 2 people on 2 occasions. That's it, according to Dr. Ramsland. So on serial killers, the article goes on serial killers and psychopaths. And this is what Ramsland is contributing. The relationship between serial killers and psychopaths looks exactly like a Venn diagram. The overlapping circles, guys. It's been a while since many of us have been in school. So not all serial killers are psychopaths, and not all psychopaths are serial killers, but some are both. The lack of empathy and remorse that most people imagine typifies a serial killer is sometimes, but not always, true. Look at it this way. The Iceman, I think, is a really good example. Do you know about the Iceman? Yes. Henry Kuklinski or whatever his name is, who was a killer for the mob. And he was also a family man. He seemed to really love killing. Like, he was really fucking into it. Yeah. But I imagine there are other people who work for the mob whose job it was to take people out who, didn't, maybe felt empathy, maybe felt remorse. We're like, I didn't want to do that, but it's my ass if I don't take care of this, Right. Like, it's a job. And they're technically serial killers because they're killing one after another for the sake of self-preservation, employment, whatever the case may be.
There's a difference, because you could say that too in politics or in, I won't go down the rabbit hole of this, but there's a lot of decisions that kill a lot of people.
Right.
And so what makes that person economically different?
Yeah.
Or again, what the motive or how it's done?
Yeah.
Is it ethical?
We really have to open this up and broaden the definition, right? Like, if we're looking at it from a political and a geopolitical standpoint, it's like, okay, I have to bomb this village.
Yes.
Because there's 2 bad guys in there. Yep. But I know 100 innocent men, women, and children are going to die. It's like, whoa.
Well, and is Hitler a serial killer?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so,
I mean,
too.
not having killed anybody himself personally, as far as I know.
Well, see, and so that's...
But he's like Charles Manson. He ordered other people to kill.
So what's the difference? And Charles Manson is called a serial killer.
Yeah, which is funny.
What's the difference?
Yeah.
Mussolini, all these different people. What's the difference between the method and the pathology behind it?
Yeah.
What we're talking about is murdering people.
Yeah, I think when you're a head of state, like, you can more easily hide behind
industrial psychopathy.
Right. The rules of war engagement or whatever the case may be.
Well, so I would argue so I'm curious with Catherine Rumsfeld's, I'm not going to argue with her. I believe that. You murdered at least 2 people on 2 occasions. What does the you mean?
Yeah. Is it literally you?
You?
Or is it you sending people to do your bidding? Yeah. I think we should definitely delve into that in a future episode. She also talks about cubing, which I thought was interesting. She said in her 12 years of communicating with Dennis Rader, the BTK killer,
creepy,
she observed a phenomenon called cubing or compartmentalizing. Ugh. She watched Rader rapidly shift personas depending on his circumstances to create different impressions on different people. Let me tell you, I've seen Dennis Rader talk, and maybe it's the context in court disclosing his crimes in a very cool and emotionless way. But I take one look at that motherfucker and I'd be like, you're pure evil.
Yes.
Like, yes. I don't care if you're a Boy Scout troop leader leading my kid's troop. I'm like, I'll trust you, Mr. Raider. Yes. I don't know. I feel like I have the ability to look at someone as hard as they are trying to pretend or purport that they're a functional, healthy member of society and be like, no, you got a dark side. Yes. I can smell it on
and
you.
And it's not like I was talking about this with another clinician today about certain individuals that just kind of give you the icks.
Yes.
And we were talking about this just really sweet person though, and like he's lovely, but I was like, I just feel creeped out.
Trust your gut.
But we feel really bad for him because he's on the spectrum, and he's sweet as pie probably, but he just creeps everyone out.
You got to trust your gut.
Right?
If your gut is telling you that there's something amiss with this person. And I genuinely believe that with women, we often tell ourselves too frequently, a narrative that softens someone when we feel this intrinsic sense of apprehension or fear.
Well, and anytime you've ever watched the documentaries or the interviews, it's the eyes for me.
Oh, for sure.
Something is off.
Yeah.
Something's not there. I don't know. And that's to me like believe in God or whatever. That's a soul.
The eyes are the windows to the soul, man. Yeah. Was that Shakespeare?
Right? I don't know.
So let's go back to cubing. So she talks about Rader cubing. She said it's called cubing because one cube are all part of the same shape, but only one face shows at a time. Psychopaths who tend to have shallow emotions and no allegiance to truth can switch seamlessly to any side of the cube. Spouse, parent, employee, stalker, serial killer. Makes sense. Also the article goes on to talk about nature versus nurture. What makes a serial killer? Genetics or life experience? The age-old nature versus nurture question is a challenging one when applied to serial killers. Catherine's answer is that it depends. For every given individual, how much is a measure of their inborn temperament versus things that happen to them is going to be different. It's true.
Yeah.
It's very nuanced and it's very individual. Nobody is born a serial killer, just as nobody is made into one. It's a combination of factors. So Ramsland says, she kind of sums it all up by saying, it really is a media-generated notion that there's a profile of a serial killer. What profile, she says? There isn't one. So generalizing about serial killers fails to recognize the ambiguity of the human condition. A high proportion of serial killers do have some of these characteristics. However, many serial killers are psychopaths. They show no empathy or remorse and have no core values or internal consistency. Many serial killers are predators. They can be secretive and deceptive and actively search for victims. And many serial killers do have a fantasy life. They imagine their crimes in advance and enact them in the real world to activate their mental reward mechanisms. They are often self-delusional. So, Carolyn, what do you think about all this?
I love these questions, Jen. I mean, again, anytime we can be flexible in our thinking about labels, I'm all for it. So let's take a quote from Asa Dawn Brown. Childhood trauma does not come in one single package.
Yes.
So again, I agree and I believe, and I not just believe, I know that biology and sociology impact the body, mind, body, whatever you want to call it. We are one. Research criminologist Dr. Adrienne Wren suggests that approximately 50% of antisocial behavior variance is attributed to genetic factors.
Interesting.
So what we know more about, and this is new, right? We're only just beginning to understand the human genome and genetics and how that influences things. So I do think that genetics and the environment absolutely work together to encourage violent behavior. For instance, a specific variant, we've talked about this in past episodes, but I'll mention again, monoamine oxidase A gene makes some individuals, or especially in males, more prone to violence. And that gets activated even more if they experience an abusive upbringing.
Interesting.
So FBI profiler Jim Clemente explained, and I love this example, genetics loads the gun while personality and psychology aim it, and experiences pull the trigger.
Oh, I love that.
Because I often will say, like, it loads the gun, but this pulls the trigger. But I love that aims it, and then it pulls the trigger.
He takes it one step further.
And I've heard that quote, too, and I never knew that was him who said it. So I was really happy about that. So again, I'll say that again. Genetics load the gun. Personality and psychology aim it, and experiences pull the trigger. Okay. So again, the connection between genetics, social environment, and criminal behavior varies across criminals. Yeah. And what we're using this to understand these factors helps in criminal profiles. It helps shed light on the complex relationship between childhood trauma and criminal choice. Many serial killers are survivors of early childhood trauma.
That's almost a universal thread with every major serial killer I know.
I'll look, but because I've heard of certain children where it's like comes from a loving family and they're violent towards a sibling, or they have violent ideations and things like that. So again, you're always going to see, we're humans. You're always going to see an outlier. Sure. But I think we can generally say that childhood trauma kind of messes with you, right? Yeah. And especially if it's physical, sexual abuse. Yeah. That's a hard one to emotional is awful too, but physical and sexual violence are fucked up, man. Family dysfunction, emotionally distant or absent parents, that also plays into it. And again, prior to this time, even psychology wasn't looking systemically at a family. Yeah. So I don't think it's that people weren't considering that. I think we just know more now. Yeah. But trauma is the single reoccurring theme in the biographies of most serial killers. And I'll even take that a step further. Trauma is what I always see in mental health. If you're not anxious and depressed because you just are that way, something has happened to you. Your symptoms are actually quite normal considering what your trauma is. For sure. And half the time I'm like, how are you even holding it together right now, given what I'm hearing? What you're telling me hurts me. How are you okay right now? Yeah. And so again, as a consequence of this trauma, they suppress their emotional response. It often goes unnoticed in society and communities. Yeah. And we miss the signs. Here's some other notable correlations, though, that, again, when we look at that Macdonald triad, I would add these in there, too. Head injury, traumatic brain injury. Yeah. We're often looking at how these injuries, and you MRIs and scans are better, but we don't really know until we can do an autopsy on a brain what's going on. But we do know that when the frontal lobe is damaged, that is impulse control, all the things that, rationale, ethics, morality. When there's ever damage to that, it's psychiatric or traumatic. Yeah. I would also say substance use. For sure. Typically that's going to be a part of that. It may even be induced. Substance-induced psychosis can later go on to be, permanent. Uncontrollable aggression, that's always a red flag to me with any kid. Children just don't tend to be that way. Something's going on. These are signs. Yep. So it's a first sign of psychopathy, and especially in adolescence when we see extreme antisocial behavior, persistent aggression. Again, my thought is something's happening to you, but what we often do, especially if you are a person of color, is we shame you more. Yeah. We make you feel lesser, and we penalize you, which only makes that aggression and that mistrust go up more. Yeah. You lose your sense of self, and now we have that cascade, right? Right. So, but we know about 30% of children displaying violent, uncontrolled verbal aggression. Again, we can contribute that to genetics as well. But again, could be from all different types of neglectful upbringing. Witnessing extreme violence. Maybe nothing's happening to you, but you're watching that happen to your parent. Or you're watching that happen to your sibling. So we know that is going to be something incredibly hard to misinterpret the impact that has. Again, I talked about sexual abuse. That's just,
that speaks for itself.
That's just a given. And they do say that, again, if you're, especially the more antisocial, the more anxious serial killers doesn't have that grandiosity or that narcissism, they are going to dabble in the peeping Tom.
Okay.
They are going to try and have that gratification, but not actually feel worthy of participating in that. They feel lesser than.
Okay.
So that, again, it can be attributed to antisocial behavior. Another one, too, compulsive lying, destruction of toys, emotional blackmail. These are me when I was a kid, to be quite honest.
Sure. Well, I think all kids display this on occasion. But when it's a pattern and a practice.
It's a pattern and you don't care.
Yeah.
It's that kid who goes, good.
Yeah.
I wanted to do that.
Right.
And again, that look, that lack of empathy and that, so what?
Yeah.
Kind of feeling. So again, you have to look at all these different things. So they're not feeling guilty after guilt is actually a healthy part of maturity and development of self.
That makes sense.
You should care if you're impacting this around you.
Well, and also too, I think it takes, correct me if I'm wrong, but it takes time for a child to develop empathy. You're not, I mean, there are some studies I've read that you're born with empathy, but I think it takes time to develop and hone that skill.
Our mammal brains, yes, the mammalian nervous system makes us reliant on each other and dependent. And so that social interdependence. Co-regulation, exactly. And you see this with some kids.
Yeah.
A kid will start crying. You might have the kid who goes over and wants to know.
Yeah.
Right? And then some kids are like, I don't fucking care what's going on. So I think that you're right, that has to get encouraged. And again, sometimes that gets too encouraged.
Yeah.
And then we go the other way.
Right.
And those are the women who go and help the serial killer. Well, he said he needed
fix him.
Yeah, or he said he needed help.
Yeah, he's salvageable.
This one I thought was really interesting. I'm actually really curious what you think about this. Fantasy came up. And living in sort of a pretend reality.
Okay.
Now this we know that actually when children have imaginary friends or live in that fantasy world can be created as an escape. When I see kids doing this after a certain age, it is a red flag for me.
Sure, that makes sense.
Why are you not finding that comfort in that outside of that?
Yeah.
So again, not that it's necessarily going to make you a serial killer, but there is those again that. This is where I can escape and I get to be in charge.
Playing Dungeons and Dragons is not a red flag necessarily. But, if you want to be a dungeon master 24/7 and don't want to participate in, everyday society, that might be problematic and a sign of something not so good to come.
Well, and this is why I'm sorry, Instagram and millennials, but we don't diagnose ourselves based off one thing.
That's right.
It's a combination of things.
That's right.
That's why people go to school and become clinicians so we can look at all this and not go, oh, you did that, you're a narcissist. It's like, no, it's systemic.
Yeah.
And nothing in our human experience happens without being in a system.
Yeah.
So to not look at all those different factors is really careless of the criminal community. Oh, I'm sorry, the criminal community. Criminals being nicer to each other. The legal structure, to not look at all those variables, to me just doesn't make any sense in this day and age.
Yeah.
And again, for the for people who are trying to solve these crimes, and people who are trying to help with recidivism and within our criminal justice system.
Yeah.
You have to look at all these things.
It's so hard too, because if we know that the origin of these antisocial and homicidal behaviors is childhood trauma, it's so hard to intercede because anybody, for the most part, can be a parent. And if it's not, by the time it's on the radar of Child Protective Services, it's usually too late in the sense that trauma has been inflicted. The trauma is going to impact the child. Not saying that it's going to lead to homicidal behavior, but it could,
Well, either way, someone's being hurt.
Right.
Whether it's the individual or they end up perpetrating abuse elsewhere. it's no one's winning.
Yeah. And that's the problematic component to me is that, but there's no way to control it, right? You can't be in everyone's home protecting children as much as
but if everyone had the right to healthcare and everyone had the right to education and everyone had access to certain things, I think that could be better community.
We can minimize.
We can, through social programming.
I don't think Amsterdam, that has an incredible universal healthcare system and education system, is breeding a lot of serial killers. Just saying. So I think you're onto something with that. Does America have the most? What's that?
Does America have the most?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. 100%. I can say that hands down.
Don't we have the most gun violence too?
Yes.
Interesting.
Yeah, we have the shittiest healthcare system. We have the easiest access to guns. We have the poorest education system, or one of the poorest education systems. And I think that all is an absolute powder keg. It's a perfect shitstorm of circumstances that contribute to things that are very uniquely American, like serial killers, though not exclusively. I know they happen elsewhere. Clearly, that French motherfucker was the first.
Here, though.
No, or mass shootings.
Yeah,
that's an American thing for the most part.
So this constant anxiety, I'm feeling like the lid's about to blow off at any moment now.
It's somewhat reasonable.
Okay.
Based on the, the country we live in and what we see. Yeah.
Oh, God.
What would you do, baby? If only it was as easy as, Family Ties, they grapple with some shit, man. But
and all the characters are all fucked up now as adults.
Seriously.
Poor Tracy Gold.
No, I don't know about Tracy Gold.
Fuck you, Carrot Cameron.
APK, man, that's my boy. I love me some. I thought I was a young Republican.
Oh, sorry. I was thinking of Growing Pains.
Oh, Growing Pains. Oh, God. Don't get me started on Kirk Cameron. He's like an evangelical weirdo.
Yeah, no, totally.
Like anti-evolution psycho, and his sister's crazy, too.
We should do a podcast on the Where Are They child stars
so we can get sued.
Alleged.
Right. Kirk Cameron is allegedly insane. All right.
What are they going to take from me, Jen? I got nothing.
They could take some stuff from me. Well, from my husband. So anyway, I'm still poor in my mind. All right, everybody, where does this leave us? Here's our final thought. We definitely see the value in trying to pinpoint commonly shared attributes of folks who become serial killers. And we understand that creating definitive linkages between childhood trauma and behavior with eventual homicidal behavior has its limits, and that each individual killer has their own unique brain, experiences, and motivation. There's an old saying that I'm going to royally fuck up, but it's something along the lines of the same boiling water that makes pasta soft makes an egg hard. So adverse childhood experiences and trauma do just that. They impact each of us differently, creating unique neural pathways in our brain that are specific to us. So
I love that.
Right? You like that shit?
I'm hungry now. I want some fucking pasta.
Let me go make you an egg, bitch. So that's not why we're here. Anyway, we hope you enjoyed this. I find this really fascinating.
I do too.
We hope you find this fascinating.
And horrifying.
And if you find this fascinating, give us 5 stars. I don't know. Maybe write a few words about how awesome we are.
Share us with your friends.
Share us with friends.
Our TikToks, repost our Instagrams. We need community right now.
Absolutely, we do. We are each other's community. We appreciate you.
Yes.
We hope you appreciate us. And in the spirit of that sentiment, our upcoming episode is going to be about what can we as the everyday person do to help save this planet, which seems to be on a collision course to hell. So, lots of happy things coming your way, motherfuckers.
We'll do some good old Jen and Carolyn bullshit too. Back to dating.
Don't worry. Yeah, we got some lighter shit coming your way as well, guys. All right. We hope you don't feel too depressed, and we hope you keep listening. We appreciate you, love you, and we'll see you next week.
Bye. Wow, that was a good. What the?